How's everybody doing? Well, it's a special honor for me to be here. I've always dreamt about coming to this festival and having an opportunity to actually have the kind of conversations that we don't get a chance to have together. This is a particularly difficult moment. Some of you know that this Thursday, one of the most important policies that was ever created to dismantle many of the obstacles that we face in fully integrating the society was struck down. The Supreme Court decided that affirmative action was no longer constitutional as it is currently practiced by many higher education institutions. Now, it's important to realize that one of the ways in which the Supreme Court talks about affirmative action is really connected to many old ideas about how racial equity and justice for Black people is often equated as reverse discrimination against white people. We saw that idea when the bus boycotters decided that they wanted to have equal access to lunch counters. That was framed as discrimination against white owners of businesses. Integration of public schools was framed as reverse discrimination against students. Even the freeing of slaves was framed as discrimination or aggression against slaveholders. So this is a very old, a very damaging idea. Unfortunately, it's an idea that we're seeing in other places these days as well. So in Texas and in Florida, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, has been eliminated in public education. Since the Great Reckoning prompted by George Floyd, 48 states have introduced legislation that labels ideas about racial justice and equity as divisive concepts. Ideas like structural racism, implicit bias, intersectionality, critical race theory, all have been rounded up and now they are banned in 27 states. Nearly half of our children in public schools are impacted by these laws that punish teachers for teaching the truth about American history. And Black authors are being pushed out of the classroom, like Toni Morrison, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Zora Neale Hurston, James Baldwin, Alice Walker, George Johnson. They've all been banned. I'm sure many of you remember just a couple weeks ago the poem that was written by Amanda Gorman that was presented at President Biden's inauguration, which is called The Hill We Climb, was taken out of elementary school. Advanced placement has taken racism out of the study of American history, and structural racism has been taken out of African American studies. This is all under the name of anti-wokeism. Now, here's what we're going to talk about. These stories may seem disparate. They might seem like disconnected ideas, but actually they're united by one idea. If you remove the ability to name and historicize the inequality we face, it then becomes impossible to address that inequality. And that is the point. So today, what we want to do is start making sense out of how all of these efforts are connected. We want to examine the current state of play, and we want to set an agenda to call in stakeholders, to call in our allies, all those who are necessary to correct the course so that we get back on course to the society that we have every right to live and thrive in. So, I am pleased to introduce our wonderful panelists who will help us with this hefty task. Alphonso David is the president and CEO of the Global Black Economic Forum. It is because of him that you all are sitting here, so please welcome him. Damon Hewitt is the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. He's been in the trenches fighting to sustain everything from voting rights to access to higher education. Please welcome him. and Malia Lazu, founder and CEO of the Lazu Group, and is a lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management. She brings the heat, she brings the fire. Please welcome her. All right, so we've got a lot to discuss in a short amount of time, so I'm going to get with it. So for ripped from the headlines, new development, I'm going to go to you first, Damon. On Thursday, as I mentioned, widely expected, the Supreme Court severely curtailed affirmative action in higher education. Now, we know this case is going to be ground zero for all other kinds of efforts to talk about race and racism, and to be about the process of trying to dismantle remaining obstacles. Yet a lot of people are confused about what this case is about. If you look at the media more or less presents it as the Supreme Court now says that you cannot replace more highly qualified Asian students with less qualified Black and brown students. That's sort of a frame. So for folks in this audience who are clearly going to have the opportunity to know about what this case really was about, give them two of the most important things that they need to understand about what this case really was about.
Well, thank you, Kim and Alphonso and Global Black Economic Forum. So what had happened was they did us dirty. And they did us dirty in a way where they tried to make it seem like they didn't. See, you know about the prior legal precedent. For 45 years, the court has upheld affirmative action on the same grounds. I've litigated those cases for 20 of those years. And by pretending that they weren't overruling anything, saying nothing's changed, we're just applying the law as it is, y'all. That's what the court said to us. When in fact, it took the law, turned it upside down, twisted it in a knot, and now makes it difficult, because if the admissions policies at Harvard and North Carolina, where we represented students and argued the case in the Supreme Court at the Lawyers Committee, if those policies don't pass muster under the Constitution, then what does? It's like a bizarre world. It's like telling you the sky is really red when you know that sky is blue. It doesn't make any sense. So it's an intellectually dishonest decision by the Supreme Court by saying nothing's changed here when in fact everything may have changed. The second big thing to know is this. Read all the concurrences and dissenting opinions if you care to, but I want you to pay attention to the conversation between Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first Black woman Supreme Court Justice,
Woo!
and Clarence Thomas. Now, Thomas is about what did not fully succeed in this case, but is the danger that looms. It is about this rabid pursuit of a race-blind society, a society that is really about erasure, erasing our history, erasing our identity, our ability to express ourselves, the ability to even see us. Because I'm not sure when he wakes up in the morning if Justice Thomas even sees himself. That's the extent of erasure. All trace of blackness gone. But as we'll talk about later in the next questions, no matter what this court does, we have to stand up, because we can't allow anything to erase us. Nothing can erase our race-conscious future, no matter what this court says. So those are the two important things from my perspective.
All right. Nothing can erase us. That has got to be at least one motto that we leave this with. Malia, let me understand what is happening in the DEI sector. From what you've been hearing from your associates, from your friends in the sector, should we be worried about possible spillover effects from this decision?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're already seeing spillover effects. And part of the reason why is, yes, there's a fatigue, but there was already a concern about getting the thing started, right? So when companies have any reason to pull back, that's what they're going to choose. Now, what my associates and I are talking about is, does our industry exist in 10 years? Right? I mean, do we have jobs in 10 years? And I think that's a really important question, because the work that we do, and especially as Black women doing DE&I work, we hold corporations accountable. And I also want to say that within our field, a majority of DE&I consultants are white women, the same beneficiaries of affirmative action. So maybe, you know, we'll see what happens with that. But right now, DE&I as a field is very concerned on how do we keep doing the work if it can't be called DE&I. And just one example, I have a global insurance client that said, we want to do DE&I trainings, but you just can't talk about race.
And so what can you talk about? I mean, if you're not going to talk about race,
what are we going to talk about?
DEI?
Exactly. Well, when I asked that, they said women, LGBTQ, accessibility. And so I said, great, if I find a black lesbian, not to go into intersectionality, but if I find a black lesbian woman in a wheelchair, can we then talk about her race,
Wow.
right? And so we may have to get it that way, right? Like, well, I work with women and I happen to work with black women. But I think that's where we're going to go. But it's frightening.
Yeah. And this is part of the consequence of erasing race and racism. Basically, diversity without race and racism means that we're not dealing, frankly, with white supremacy and many of its legacies. So, Alphonso, let me come to you. One of the challenges is that some of these cases that aren't explicitly about race actually have racial effects. And our inability to understand that means that we might not know how we're impacted by some of these policies. So yesterday, the Supreme Court overturned President Biden's student debt relief plan. Now, a lot of folks don't see it as a race case, but let me drop a fact on you. Black women have the highest average total of student debt, about $40,000. So what should people understand about the long-term racially disparate consequences of student debt for black students, for their families, and for black communities?
The long-term implications for this decision, and I think all of these decisions, is to keep us uneducated. That's the goal. How do we make sure that people of color, and specifically black people, don't have the education to succeed? And if we can identify all of the pillars that support an educational construct for people of color, and we remove them, then they simply won't get the education they need. And if you don't have the education, you can't compete. If you can't compete, you can't establish wealth. If you can't establish wealth, you see where the line goes.
Yeah.
So I think this decision, among many others, goes to the heart of whether we are acknowledging our history. There is a history here in this country that these decisions seek to erase. We cannot pretend slavery didn't happen, but that is what some of these decisions are seeking to do. Because you have to recognize that the vestiges of slavery and discrimination are the reasons we have some of these policies now. So when you say these policies are no longer constitutional, i.e. what Damon is saying, what you're indirectly saying is, we're pretending slavery didn't happen, and we're pretending the impact didn't happen. We should just pretend it's racially neutral and everyone's equal. And that's just not true.
Right, right.
So the long-term effects, I think ultimately will mean less people will go to college, because it's expensive and getting more expensive every day. And it'll mean the wage gap will continue to increase. Martin Luther King gave a speech in 1960. March on Washington, I may have the date wrong, but not in March on Washington speech. The wage gap was 8-to-1. Guess what the wage gap is today? 12-to-1.
So the wage gap has gotten worse.
Yes.
And that's a part of the economic consequences of discrimination and not dealing with the structured way in which inequality distributes burdens differently that we are now dealing with. So as much as people try to say that was a long time ago, sometimes time makes it even worse. Wealth gaps have increased, for example, over time. So I want you to hold on to the mic because I want to come back to you right now. So when we last checked in 2020, racial justice was everywhere. Everybody was saying, we're with you, African Americans. We stand beside you. Corporations were putting money on the table. They were making new positions. It seemed as though something was going to happen. 3 years later, something did happen. There is a movement. It is huge. It's growing across the country. It is not our movement. It is the anti-woke movement. So tell us what happened. What conditions existed for this backlash against George Floyd, against the activation that happened in all 50 states? What made it so easy for this backlash to now take over and be more powerful than our movement was in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder?
I mean, I think there's several reasons why that happened. When I think about George Floyd, and I think about the horrifying visuals that we all had to process, I remember one thing in terms of this context, and that is we couldn't leave our homes. We were all living at home because of COVID. They couldn't ignore the television screen, right? We had to recognize what was happening because of COVID. Well, now we're all busy. We're running around. And even though black people are still being killed today, we're not seeing the same response. And the pressure on corporations, on multinational businesses to respond to racial justice has alleviated. And when we depressurized it, they felt the need not to respond. So this highlights the importance of us collectively keeping the pressure on. If we don't keep the pressure on, they won't respond.
Yeah. If we can't change the equation on the ground, there's no reason for them not to continue doing exactly what they're doing. So I want to come back to the DEI question. So yesterday we read that executives, DEI executives at Warner Brothers, Discovery, Disney, Netflix, and the Motion Picture Academy were either laid off or left their jobs in the last 10 days. And many of these people were hired during the reckoning that was inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. A scant 3 years later, we're told that there is diversity exhaustion. Now, they're exhausted after 3 years of trying to do the right thing. We ain't exhausted after 3 centuries of experiencing this. So what does this reveal about the challenges that DEI professionals are facing in the midst of this so-called war on wokeness?
You know, that is such a great question because we all knew that the pressure after George Floyd was going to be fleeting, right? Like, and that's why we were like, we may have 5 years, try to get everything passed, try to get all this done, right? So we know this comes in cycles. I think what we need to reckon with and wrestle with, and I think it's important really for us to wrestle with this is, are we going to have this fight, right? So what does it mean if Netflix gets rid of Vernay? What are we doing to Netflix? Right? And at the end of the day, as you said, without the pressure, there is no need to change, you know? So when we look at the DE&I officers, yes, we're losing them. They're losing their budgets and they're losing their power. And so I think it's critical to recognize that we influence corporations in 2 ways. 1, how we buy, and 2, who we work for. And making those decisions are really, really important. Who's gonna get our money when they're tired of helping us for 3 years? That's what we have to ask, and I think we need to have a conversation with ourselves. Are we willing to live without Netflix? Okay, are we willing? Are we?
Are we willing to live without Netflix? All right.
That's right, they got rid of Vernay. Hashtag save Vernay. And the last thing I want to say is, if we just look at who we have in this room, in this center right here, not even including what we're going to do tonight at Caesars, If all of us decided to stay home for one day, we would have different conversations. So we are fatigued too. I want to honor and recognize that. And I want us to ask ourselves, what are we willing to break?
Thank you, thank you. Y'all ready for that? That's the least we can do, right? Damon, I think a lot of people don't understand the scale of the problem, and particularly the way that law has been used to weaponize this right-wing agenda. Tell us a little something about how that has worked, what the laws are doing, how they've been able to make anti-racism illegal.
Exactly. So it takes a perverse kind of logic to follow what these folks are doing. Let me try to make it plain. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution, one of the Reconstruction Amendments, came out of the Civil War, fought over chattel slavery, was supposed to be a shield to protect us from discrimination by government. It's now being used as a spear, and they are stabbing us with that spear. They turned the law on its head and say everything that you thought was up is now down. They have done this through conservative federal courts and the Supreme Court in particular with these perverse interpretations, but they're also doing it at the state level. And it's not just interpretations by courts, it's also your state legislatures. You know, Kim mentioned all the states that are now banning curriculum and books. But over years, there have been over a dozen states that are banning affirmative action at the state level. In places like California, Washington State, right? Michigan, right? And even when they don't ban at the state level, you see state college systems like Georgia saying, well, our state didn't ban it outright, but we're going to ban it for the colleges here. So they're taking every instrumentality of the law and saying, we're not going to allow it to be used for opportunity. We're going to turn it on its head. And this is really a political move. This is, let's be frank, this is the politics of white grievance, of misplaced grievance, a politics that says something's being taken away from us, which is simply not the case. Because, you know, affirmative action is not a handout. It's not a hand up. It's what we deserve. There's nobody unqualified getting these positions.
That's right.
They might have said my test score was low in law school, but I sure did kill it for the last 20-some years.
Speak.
Right?
Speak.
So we're all super qualified, but they're trying to turn this around so that every way we go, they're treating us like mice in a maze. Everywhere you run, it's blocked, it's blocked, it's blocked. So what we have to do is bust those walls down.
That's right. That's right.
So
we ain't
Damon,
no damn mice.
I want you to hold on to the mic and answer this question. We know that telling Black history honestly is also a banned concept. There are 27 states that are now saying you can't tell Black history if it makes certain kids feel bad.
Yeah.
So tell us, moving beyond DEI, something that cannot be understood appropriately without our history.
Here's a quick example. So people talk about rules and policies as if that's just the way things are. But things are the way they are for a reason. You ever heard about legacy admissions?
Thank you.
Legacy preferences?
Thank you.
So like if your mama and them and your grandfather and your great-grandmother and your ancestors go to school, then you're going to get a free pass too? Well, guess who couldn't go to the University of North Carolina 50 years ago? Legally banned from even going. This reminds me of voting rights, Kim, because there was a thing in voting rights, one of those mechanisms to stop us from voting, called the grandfather clause. And that said, if your grandfather could vote, then you could vote. But if your grandfather was legally prohibited from voting, then you can't vote. It is a perverse logic. And so legacy admissions is really racial preference for white people. That's exactly what it is. And so we have to break that down and say, if you have a school that's saying we're not going to consider race anymore the way we used to, then you better not be considering legacy preferences, because we believe that is a civil rights violation.
That's right. That's right. So, Malia, concepts like implicit bias or intersectionality have also been framed as divisive concepts that can't be taught in these 27 states. So can you give us an example of dynamics that happen in workplaces that cannot be understood or addressed without these concepts?
Absolutely. You know, when I'm working with clients, we sit in culture, right? Because we know culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that you could have the best strategy that you want, and if your culture doesn't want it, it's not going to move forward. And so what we try to do is talk about what is Black culture, what is BIPOC culture, what is intersectionality, because we're not just Black people, right? We come with that intersectionality. What do we need to thrive in community, in our work? And the number one thing is I want to be able to be myself. I want to be able to go to work and not put on this mask of professionalism a la white heteronormativity. I want to be able to, if I want to wrap my hair, I can wrap my hair and not feel like I have to explain anything. And so we need these words because we need to identify what's not happening in the workplace that doesn't allow Black people, brown people to bring their whole selves. So if I can't talk about the intersectionality of someone's lived experience, then I can't talk about their humanity. And if I can't talk about their humanity, then I can't talk about equity. There's no way to talk about equity without talking about humanity. And I think, you know, thinking now that at any point I could have one of my clients' general counsel call me and tell me that I'm putting my client at risk by talking about these words, that's fascism, right? That's live fascism. Right. It's alive and well. And I think it's really important that we don't see this as just another thing. Right. Just another thing that we have to endure. Hashtag strong Black women, we can endure anything. I don't think we want to use our resiliency here. I think we want to use our urgency. I think we want to use our impatience. I think we want to use our love. We want to use our solidarity to actually build a new culture in these companies. Absolutely. So it's without these words, without being able to talk about the history, when someone says, well, that's reverse racism, I can't laugh in their face and say, that's ridiculous. Let me tell you why reverse racism does not exist.
That's right.
Right? All of a sudden it becomes this false equivalency. And that's why we need folks like the Lawyers Committee to give me all the legal mumbo jumbo, so that when a client comes up or a general counsel comes up and tells me I can't do this, I can explain to them why I can. Because I'm sorry, the last thing I want to say is during DE&I, during the height of DE&I, Obama as president, we were still told this goes against fair lending practices, this goes against EEOC, right? So even when everything was good, we were told, well, you can't just have a policy for Black women. Why not? Why not, right? Yeah. So that's where
they certainly have a policy against Black women.
Exactly, and shout out, Johnson & Johnson right now actually has an HR policy just for Black people. And it's really important that we support Johnson & Johnson in continuing to do things like that.
All right. My favorite implicit bias example, I'm sure many people have had it. You say something in a meeting, it's a good idea. There's crickets. Yes. Then Karen
Tad
says exactly the same thing, and it's like the greatest thing they've ever heard. That's implicit bias. Alphonso, I'm going to come to you and ask for everybody's last response, and we're going to combine a question. So we've been talking about the concepts that they're trying to ban that without, we can't really understand contemporary inequality. So I'm curious about how these ideas that they're trying to ban compromise our efforts to address opportunity gaps in business or wealth gaps in society. If we don't address these things, if we don't all come together and fight hard, what do you think the world for us will look like in 2033? What do we need in order to make sure that story that we're heading to doesn't actually happen?
Look, I think the decisions that have come out this year alone are going to take us back decades. And when I said the wealth gap in the 1960s was 8-1, and today is 12-1, if we do nothing, it will be 20-1 in 5 years. Let's just be clear. This is a state of emergency. We shouldn't pretend that those decisions don't have the impact that they're going to have. Less black people and brown people will get into prestige universities. Less black and brown people will get into high-powered jobs. Because the principles and the tools, the legal principles and tools that we've been fighting, I'm a lawyer, I've been doing this for 20 years. The tools that we've been using to ensure that racial injustice and oppressive policies are stripped away, we won't have those tools. And if we don't have those tools, we can't fight back in the way that we need. So I'm concerned about what this looks like. What does the landscape look like in large companies? What does the landscape look like in places that we need to be? What does the landscape look like in certain neighborhoods? In certain parts of this country, you still have the black side of town and the white side of town. And that's going to get worse unless we take action, and we take action now.
And Damon, I'm going to come to you on that same question. What does the world look like for racial justice in 2033 if we don't have a massive response, reinforcing our troops, having new supply lines in this struggle? What happens if we lose this so-called war on woke?
If you don't coordinate and fight, if you don't organize, if you don't fight for the future we deserve, you might get into college, one of your children or grandchildren might get in, but you know what's going to feel like? You're going to feel like Ruby Bridges, like you're desegregating the place all over again, because you might be the only one in your classroom, you might be the only one in that dorm, you walk through the crowd on campus. It doesn't feel right to me. If you don't fight for the future you deserve, you will be giving your money to companies that wouldn't even hire you. They wouldn't think twice about it. If you don't fight for the future you deserve, and if you don't vote,
Say it.
and vote in your interests, you are going to not just get more of the same, you're going to get this squared. Because all this power that is vested in federal courts, people that have lifetime tenure, these are not elected judges in federal courts. They're appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. They have lifetime tenure. For the rest of your natural black life, they're going to govern what your opportunity is and continue to twist the law. So we have to fight.
We have to fight. You heard that. For the rest of your natural-born black life, you have to fight. Leah, you get the last word, 30 seconds. What does it look like in 2033 if we don't fight now?
It looks like we all trying to go back to Ghana and do it again from there. I mean, we may have to repatriate, right? I don't know. I think we think of being American and this fight as inevitable, and it's not, right? There was a time where we had even less rights than we have now, and that is the beginning of this country, and I think we may go back to that if we don't fight. We may actually lose what little we've gained, and we can't let that happen, you know? So we have to fight, or we have to decide to go somewhere else and do it somewhere else. And whatever we do, let's just do it collectively and with love.
Well, one of the things we know is that we can't fight unless we know what we're fighting for. We can't envision a transformed world unless we know the history from which we came. So in every state, including this one, where there are laws on the books that tell us that we can't pass on to our children what was passed on to us, we cannot sit down while that is standing up. We have got to stand up against this repression.